Hi guys, how you doing? It's Friday, the 10 o'clock class is finished. I've just finished setting up for Sunday's strength and conditioning session, which is a good day. You got some hip thrusts in there, some overhead presses and lots of other wee tasty exercises. So Jodie and Siobhan are going to be taking that session, so those that are going to enjoy that. I've decided I want to try and get into the habit of doing like a weekly almost like debrief of the training from the week before, well the week just gone. So obviously we've just finished the first week there. And session A and B went really well. It was great to be back. There's a great atmosphere, as I already mentioned at the sessions. I thought it's just a good buzz, really, isn't it? When there's that amount of people all training together and all training with a bit of intent. The beginners have done great. It will take you guys a few weeks just to get the hang of your surroundings, I guess, some of the movements. So a lot of what I probably say in the first few debriefs here, the briefs, you can kind of disregard a little bit because you're still just getting used to everything. But like I said, I wanted to just sort of touch upon a few things that I think might help going forward, and also just to give you a rough idea of some of the general thoughts behind some of the exercise selections and why we're doing them and what the purpose of it is and things like that. So obviously we started this week with a lot of isometrics. You had your Tuesday and Monday there in session A, you had your hamstring isometrics. I mentioned in the exercise video about why we're doing that and what it's for. The one-legged squat isometrics, I mentioned that as well. It's really good for strength, just a general bit of strengthening around the hip. It's really good for strengthening the muscles around the knee, the VMO in particular. So if anyone has got knee pain, wall isometric in particular, a one-legged wall isometric is a really great gateway exercise that most people can do, or they can find an angle that allows them to do it without pain, and then they can build on that. That's what I've found from my own experience of my own issues with knee tendonitis and things like that. So we're going to incorporate those exercises for another week, next week certainly, because I think they're just great exercises. They build a lot of general strength, and like I said, they build a lot of resilience and allow the muscles around the knee in particular and the hip as well to work in a way that they're not used to working. So I think everyone agreed they were really tough. Another benefit of isometrics, because we also did isometrics in session B as well, the hip thrust one in particular, the one-legged hip thrust. So again, it's a really great chance to focus on a bit of hip stability via the glutes, while also thinking about positioning, and also we're incorporating a little bit of upper body work because you're doing that exercise contralaterally, which essentially just means you're working opposite sides of the body at the same time. It's giving you a chance to work on a bit of hip and core stability simultaneously. So we're ticking a few boxes all at once. And the reason the contralateral work is quite important is because our gait cycle when we walk and run is that the body works as one, but it works contralaterally. So when one hip extends, the other one flexes, and so on. So these sort of exercises, the contralateral ones, I'm a fan of incorporating because they serve a function, not just about, oh, I want to work the glutes, I want to work the muscle, I want to, because there's such a focus on aesthetics and developing the muscles and how they look, which is fine. We all want to look good and stuff, but there also has to be a certain focus on function and how it then translates outside the weight room and into the real world, whether that's just every day how you feel and move, or whether it's to actually improve performance in whatever sport you're doing. So there's been a lot of isometrics. Another benefit of the isometrics, and why I like to incorporate them a lot in the first few weeks, is that either you've not trained in a while or you're new. And the benefit of isometrics is because there's not an eccentric component to them, there's a limited amount of delayed onset muscle soreness in the days after. So I like to ask folk how sore they were in the first week, and the answer that I'm looking for isn't, oh my god, I could barely walk. Yeah, there's going to be a wee bit of that because of some of the exercises weren't isometrics, but I like to incorporate an isometric component because it manages the total volume of time under tension in the eccentric phase, which therefore should minimise or at least like manage the amount of DOM, because I don't want you walking about like in agony for a week, especially if you're new. That would put you off. So the hope is that we're sort of managing the days after the session with incorporating these isometrics as well. I briefly mentioned there about the whole idea of thinking about the concept of not just working the muscles like for the sake of like looking good, but to translate outside the gym, and that's why one reason why we do these sort of contralateral movements. But another thing I wanted to mention is, I touched upon it in the email about the idea of open and closed chain exercises. So a lot of these ideas I've got in my head come full circle. So you've got this idea you often hear that you can't just because you're getting stronger in squats and deadlifts and bench press, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to improve your performance outside the weight room. So if that were the case, then all the guys that were the strongest in the weight room would all be the fastest runners, or they'd all be the best at whatever sport they do. That's not the case. We know that's not the case. So it's getting the balance or finding the right way to knit together the weight room work with other exercises that will then like bridge the gap to then improve performance outside of the weight room. Equally though, and on that note, I think that there is sometimes people that are just wanting to train for the sake of the look, which is absolutely fine, nothing wrong with that. They probably miss a trick a lot of the time because they just maybe just focus on hip thrusts, or they just focus on lunges, and they just focus on time under tension and dead slow controlled eccentrics, which obviously you know I'm a big fan of, but you've also got to consider the other aspect, another element to athleticism and muscle recruitment and muscle firing, and that is like explosiveness and control and stability and balance, which you can't do. You can't train it all at once if you're just doing the same thing over and over again, i.e. hip thrusts. So in these sort of more familiar Instagram exercises that you tend to see. So the goal is to try and incorporate them all. Like I mentioned, this whole idea of open and closed chain exercises. So for example, when it comes to like improving like your glute recruitment or size or definition, then I would suggest that like one of the things that most folk are probably missing out on is jumping, hopping and sprinting, which is what we're trying to do. A wee bit of the jumping and the hopping in the classes, but obviously the running fast can only come if you go and do it or go to the Saturday session. And that's why, I mean, there's a reason, that's the main reason why sprinters usually traditionally have the best developed glutes of any sport, because they sprint a lot, and the glutes are the biggest muscles in the body. They play a huge part in stabilising and managing sort of the forces that are being created when sprinting via the hamstrings, the calves, the glutes, and the abs, etc., and the shoulders. So the glutes have got a huge role to play, and if you want to maximise their development and other muscles development, then you need to challenge them in all the different ways and the roles that they can play. And for a lot of folk, it's probably the more athletic development type of things that people are missing out on. They just stick to the gym all the time and they don't focus on a bit more speed and explosive work. On that same note, when it comes to open and closed chain exercises, an example, I wanted to just briefly touch upon this to give you examples. How you doing, guys? Sorry I got cut off there because my phone ran out of memory, so I had to I'll just add this wee bit in at the end. I just wanted to touch upon, because it kind of ties in with everything I've been saying, about this concept of the difference between an open and a closed chain exercise. I mentioned it in an email during the week and how it can all relate to like performance and general like movement ability out with the gym. So generally speaking, most gym work is what you'd consider or probably call closed chain movements. So they're not wrong or bad, they're obviously massively beneficial. So hip thrusts, squats, these are all examples of closed chain movements. And what that essentially just means is that the furthest part of your body generally is anchored. So your foot, when you're doing squats, for example, your feet are on the ground and you're pushing away from the ground, but your feet stay where they are. And the reason it's probably worthwhile knowing that and being aware of it in relation to like movement and gait cycle and performance is that, and how to bridge the gap, is that running and walking are open chain movements. Like your feet are free to move. Like, so when you're squatting and you're deadlifting, you're still performing hip extension and hip flexion, but in a closed chain movement. Whereas open chain movement, like the feet move, the furthest point in the body, your feet are not anchored to the ground, obviously. So an example of an open chain movement that we've done this week, for example, is the weighted hip flexor knee drive. And if you think about it, it very much mimics the movement that you're doing when you run. That's the whole benefit of it. So you're going into that hip flexion position. So if you think about it, like when you squat down, you're flexing your hips, so your quad is coming here, isn't it, towards your chest. So you're closing that gap. That's what hip flexion is here, but which is exactly the same as when you're doing a weighted hip flexor knee drive. So like, do you know what I mean? So the finish point, like if you look at that could, if you took a photo of that, it's the same idea. So you're in both those exercises, you're flexing your hips. One's closed though, one's a closed chain and one's an open chain, so you're working them in quite different ways, to be honest, to the point where your hip flexor and your quad probably doesn't even do much work, or you won't really feel it much at all, really, and it won't have a lot of recruitment in a squat or a lunge, whereby the weighted hip flexor is very much targeted along with other ones. So that's an example of trying to like build your general strength through the bigger movements, but then trying to also like build the specific strength required for outside. You'll also notice that when you're doing that weighted hip flexor one, it hits your stabilising glute on your standing leg. So again, while one hip's flexing, one's extending, both have got a role to play, which is exactly what happens when you run and when you sprint and when you walk. So it's again, it's almost like an example really of a contralateral movement. This one, although it's not moving, it's an isometric. You're isometrically contracting these muscles in your glutes to stabilise your hips while you target this hip flexion through the opposite leg. So yeah, I'm probably rambling on a wee bit here. It's quite hard to summarise it without going into, because you end up just going from one thing to the other. But the only other thing I wanted to mention was, I mentioned it last week, make every session count and make every exercise count and make every rep count. Again, this isn't really maybe as relatable to the new guys because you're just getting used to it, but I just felt this week, second week in particular, wee bit of like slowness to get into the Xerxer squats and the one-arm deadlifts. If there was one section that you could have probably pushed it a little bit more, it would have been that one. And I think it's partly the problem of, because you're there for a certain amount of time, there's a lot of just going back and forward between the exercises. Remember, with strength training, if you're doing it properly, you need to rest, particularly in the bigger movements like Xerxer squats. So remember, those 8 reps are a rule of thumb that if you can do 8 reps, put more weight in the bar in your next set. So try and remember that. Like I want us to really not waste any sessions and push beyond what push to what you're capable of and not stay in the comfort zone. And I just felt there was a maybe wee bit of comfort zoning going on in the Xerxer squats. Now, the reason it's important to differentiate between a comfort zone and general aerobic fatigue is important because everyone was working hard on that section. Because if you're going back and forward, it's going to be knackered, your heart rate's going to be up. But there's a difference between like working hard because you're lifting heavier and working hard just because you're doing lots of volume. So I want you to just remember that, like, you can take rest in between sets if it's to accommodate a heavier load, which is what you're trying to do going forward. So I just wanted to address that wee point because we're in week 1 and it's been brilliant, but at the same time, my job as a coach is probably just to try and highlight things I think, generally speaking, could be sort of like thought about a bit more in terms of trying to improve on, and that would be probably one. Just try to push that wee bit more and just try and keep that thought in your mind for every session going forward, that you continue to try and push your own personal boundaries. If you can do 8 or 9 reps on something, go up a weight. As long as your form's good, that's all you need to do, you know. Anyway, cheers. I've gone on a bit longer than I meant to, but yeah, see you soon.